The Pennsylvania Dutch are not Dutch. They never were. The name is a 300-year-old mistake, a corruption of the word Deutsch, German, mangled by English ears until it stuck for good. Everyone who corrects the record stops there, satisfied. German, not Dutch. Case closed. But modern genetic and historical research has traced the story much further than that simple correction, down to a radius of 150 miles on the Rhine, and a bloodline so tightly preserved that scientists can now point to the exact villages this population came from, 3 centuries and an ocean later. Long before they boarded ships for Pennsylvania, their forebears lived in a patchwork of small states along the upper Rhine River. The heart of this homeland was a territory known as the Electoral Palatinate, or simply the Palatinate, a fragmented principality stretching along both sides of the Rhine, its vineyards and wheat fields anchored by the twin cities of Heidelberg and Mannheim. Just to the east lay the Duchy of Württemberg, a hilly realm of terraced orchards and the deep forests of the Swabian Jura. South of the Palatinate, across the river, sat the Margraviate of Baden, and to the west, nestled between the Rhine and the Vosges Mountains, the fertile plain of Alsace. Then, a German-speaking cultural region of the Holy Roman Empire, though politically fracturing under French pressure. These were the precise wellsprings. Modern genetic surveys, comparing Y-chromosome markers and mitochondrial lineages, consistently point to villages within a radius of roughly 150 miles, places like Kaiserslautern, Bad Dürkheim, Esslingen, and the rural communities around the Black Forest's western fringe. 17th-century church registers and land tax records confirm the same surnames that would later appear on Philadelphia ship manifests. It was a land of half-timbered villages and Roman-tiled church spires, of medieval market squares and the constant sound of the Rhine's current. But it was also a land hollowed out by war. The 30 Years' War had reduced some districts to a third of their pre-war population. Then, in the 1680s and 1690s, the armies of Louis XIV scorched the Palatinate, burning Mannheim to the ground and ruining thousands of farms. This repeated devastation, layered over religious friction and feudal obligation, primed the entire region for a mass exodus. The river valleys that had defined life for centuries were about to become the starting point for a journey across the Atlantic. The Peace of Westphalia, signed in 1648, had promised an end to religious bloodshed, but on the ground, it simply carved the German lands into a patchwork of Catholic, Lutheran, and Calvinist principalities. A Palatine farmer who refused the creed of his local prince faced confiscation of his land, forced billeting of soldiers, or exile. In the electorate of the Palatinate alone, rulers switched confessional demands 4 times in a single century. The psychological toll was devastating. Then came the armies of Louis XIV. During the War of the Grand Alliance, French troops marched into the Rhine Valley in 1689. Their orders were explicit: reduce the Palatinate to ashes. Heidelberg, Mannheim, Speyer, Worms, entire cities were methodically burned. Vineyards were hacked down, livestock slaughtered, wells poisoned. For miles along the river, nothing remained but blackened chimneys standing where farmhouses had been. Survivors sheltered in cellars, eating roots and grass. Taxation made recovery impossible. A single family might owe simultaneous obligations to a local lord, a regional prince, and the Holy Roman Emperor. The tithe took 1/10 of every harvest. The protection tax, the land tax, the marriage fee, the list was endless. A series of catastrophic crop failures struck in the 1690s and again in 1708 and 1709. The winter of 1708 to 1709 froze the Rhine solid for weeks. Vineyards died. Wheat rotted in the ground. Starving families boiled tree bark for sustenance. The choice was no longer whether to leave, but when. Into that despair stepped an unlikely figure, an English Quaker with a royal charter and a desperate need for settlers. William Penn had received a vast tract of woodland in the New World from King Charles II in 1681, a land he named Pennsylvania. But to make his holy experiment a reality, he needed farmers, artisans, and their families, and he knew exactly where to find them. Penn turned his gaze east to the Rhine Valley. For decades, this region had been a corridor of fire. The 30 Years' War, followed by relentless French invasions under Louis XIV, had reduced the Palatinate to a wasteland. Entire villages vanished. Survivors were left destitute, their homes burned, their fields trampled. Penn saw not just suffering, but an opportunity. He began printing promotional pamphlets in German and distributing them along the Rhine. These tracts, often titled with plain urgency, "Some Account of the Province of Pennsylvania," were carried by agents into market towns and churchyards. The promises were astonishing to ears accustomed to tyranny and war. Penn guaranteed 50 acres of fertile land to every settler, with additional acreage for servants, all at a modest quitrent. He vowed absolute religious freedom for all Protestants, no state church, no tithes, no persecution. He offered a representative assembly where settlers would have a voice. And he stressed political neutrality, no military conscription, no forced levies to fight in Europe's endless dynastic bloodshed. For a Palatine farmer watching his children starve, the pamphlets read less like an advertisement and more like a benediction. Penn's gamble was that these people, so broken by the old world, would build his new one. The crossing began in Rotterdam, where agents packed human cargo into vessels meant for timber and trade goods. These were not passenger ships. Families paid their fare by signing redemptioner contracts, a form of temporary indentured servitude sold to the highest bidder upon arrival in Philadelphia. A typical contract bound a healthy adult for 4 to 7 years. Children as young as 6 could be bound until they turned 21. The voyage itself took 8 to 12 weeks, depending on storms. Below deck, in spaces with barely 5 feet of headroom, roughly 300 souls were crammed into berths, just 18 inches wide. Ventilation was almost non-existent. The stench of vomit, sweat, and waste hung thick in the darkness. Ship fever, typhus, and dysentery spread through the holds with brutal efficiency. Mortality rates on these Palatine crossings routinely reached 15 to 20%. On some voyages, a third of the passengers never saw land. Captains logged deaths in ledger books with chilling brevity. A child, aged 3, of flux. A woman, in childbirth, both lost. Families that had already fled burning farms and French troops now shattered again in the middle of the Atlantic. It was common for a father to arrive in Philadelphia alone, his wife and children buried at sea. Or a brother and sister, now orphans, clutching a contract that sold their labor to strangers for the next decade. These broken remnants of Palatine clans stepped onto the docks at Penn's colony, not as settlers, but as survivors of a second devastation. Yet here, on the shores of the New World, a remarkable transformation began. The survivors stepped from the chaos of the docks into a different kind of challenge, the immense, silent forest of Pennsylvania. They did not scatter into the wilderness alone. Instead, they clustered together, driven by memory and necessity. With axes and stubborn will, they began the slow, back-breaking work of carving orderly farms from the limestone valleys. They chose lands that reminded them of home, fertile, rolling country in places like Lancaster, Berks, and Lehigh counties. Here, they did not adopt the isolated homesteads of other colonists. They consciously recreated the tight-knit village structures they had known in the Palatinate and Switzerland. A central church, or Kirche, anchored the community. Farmsteads were built close together, their distinctive banked barns and fenced gardens forming a familiar Germanic footprint upon the land. This was not a random settlement. It was a deliberate transplantation. They surveyed fields using European methods, planted crops like rye and spelt they had brought as seed, and built their first homes from the very limestone they cleared. The community itself was the first and most vital crop. In this replication of village life, they forged a bulwark against the wilderness, a social DNA that would prove far more durable than the hardships of the voyage. They were no longer just survivors. They were now builders, laying the first physical stones of a culture that would endure for centuries. Within a generation, their settlement lines had hardened. They drew tight around river valleys in Lancaster, Berks, and Lehigh counties, places where an English voice was an intrusion. Relatives from the same Palatine villages bought adjoining plots. Whole townships filled with speakers of a single tongue, a dialect the outside world would never quite name. They called it Deutsch, the language of the people. It was not a pristine import. The crossing had already stripped it. On the ships from Rotterdam, farmers from the Kraichgau, weavers from the lower Neckar, and vine dressers from the Nahe had been forced to sand down their local peculiarities. What emerged in Pennsylvania was a leveled dialect, rooted in the Pfälzisch of the Middle Rhine, but carrying shards of Swabian, Alsatian, and Hessian grammar. In the clapboard meeting houses of Berks County, a deacon read the scripture in Luther's High German, then the sermon unfolded in Deutsch. That pattern preserved a diglossia, formal worship in one tongue, barn raising and childbirth in another. Geographic clustering did the heavy lifting. For 150 years, an arc of German-speaking farmland from Allentown to York remained a world apart. English-speaking officials called them the Dutch, not out of confusion, but out of linguistic gravity. The word Deutsch is foreign to an English tongue. Dutch was close enough, already a label for the Netherlanders across the Delaware, and so the misnomer calcified. In wills and tax rolls, the Pennsylvania Dutch were recorded before they could correct it. The Deutsch speakers themselves rarely required English. Their land deeds were in German script, their newspapers in Fraktur type. By 1775, roughly 70% of southeastern Pennsylvania's population spoke German dialects. They did not need to argue about the name. They simply went on building in their own language, while the English-speaking world sealed their identity behind a single, stubborn syllable. The syllables of a name, however stubborn, are only sound. Beneath them, blood tells a quieter, more precise story. In the last decade, geneticists turned to the descendants of these so-called Dutch. They sampled saliva from families with 8, 9, 10 generations, rooted in Berks and Lancaster counties. What they found rewrote the narrative. The DNA reveals an astonishing fortress of endogamy. For close to 3 centuries, these communities married almost entirely within their own. The genetic markers did not point to a broad, blended Central Europe. Instead, they narrowed with laser precision to a single upland corridor, the Mittelgebirge, the low, forested highlands between the Rhine and the Elbe. Specifically, a cluster of villages in the Palatinate, the northern reaches of Baden and southern Hesse. The ancestral signatures, certain Y-chromosome haplogroups, rare mitochondrial variants, matched almost exactly the modern populations still living in those same valleys. What this disproves is the old assumption of a chaotic, pan-Germanic mixing pot. The emigrants who boarded ships in Rotterdam were not a random sample of the German-speaking world. They were a highly specific breeding population, shaped by the geography of the hills. The genetic distance between a Pennsylvania Amish farmer and a man in Odenwald or the Vogelsberg is often smaller than the distance between that farmer and his neighbor of English stock. The data shows that in most cases, Over 90% of a typical plain person's ancestry can be pinned to roughly 24 villages in the Mittelgebirge. A founder effect so strong it survived the Atlantic crossing, the Revolution, and the steam engine. The name may have been a mistake, but the bloodline is a map. That bloodline map, however, traced two very different futures. By the 1830s, the unified German-speaking world of the Pennsylvania backcountry began to fracture along a religious fault line. On one side stood the stricter Anabaptist sects, the Amish, who had already separated from the Mennonites in the 1690s, now doubled down on isolation, rejecting railroads, telegraphs, and the English-language schools sweeping through the countryside. The Old Order Mennonites, emerging from a series of internal splits around 1872, locked themselves into a similar posture: plain dress, horse and buggy, the Pennsylvania German dialect as a wall against the outside world. They became the Plain Dutch. On the other side were the Lutheran and Reformed congregations. Their ancestors had worshipped in the same stone churches as the Anabaptists, but these groups stepped deliberately into the American mainstream, learning English, voting in elections, opening their farms to new machinery. Yet they did not disappear. They became the Fancy Dutch, preserving a distinct identity not through separation, but through food and festival. The aroma of fastnacks on Shrove Tuesday, the sizzle of scrapple in a cast-iron pan, the communal hum of a Sangerfest. A single genetic lineage, still visible in the bone structure of a Lancaster County face, had split into two worlds, one sealed in amber, the other simmering in a pot of Schnitz und Nepp. The DNA could not tell them apart. But a Sunday morning in 1880 would show you precisely which path a family had chosen. By the turn of the 20th century, the Deutsch tongue was slowly retreating from the farmhouse kitchen. Public schooling mandated English, and the shadow of the First World War made German speech a liability. In 1910, roughly 800,000 Pennsylvanians still spoke a German dialect at home. By 1970, that number had collapsed to fewer than 80,000. The old words for calf and plow, for hymn and harvest, were vanishing from the air. Yet, in a strange paradox, the outward symbols of that culture were being born anew as commodities. The same decades that saw the language erode witnessed the rise of a tourist landscape marketed as Pennsylvania Dutch country. Barn stars, once painted by farmers to ward off harm, were reproduced on postcards and trinkets. Hex signs, rooted in Fraktur folk art, were sold as colorful souvenirs to motorists along new highways. Scrapple, a frugal dish of pig scraps and cornmeal, moved from the farmstead table to the menus of roadside inns, labeled as a regional delicacy. The visual markers of identity were lifted, polished, and sold back to an eager public, while the very voice that named them grew quiet. The DNA of the people remained largely unchanged, a dense web of Rhineland alleles. But the cultural genome was being rewritten. A Sunday morning in 1880 revealed the chosen path. By the 1950s, the church pews still held the descendants, yet the sermon was often in English, and the old Deutsch hymns were fading into memory, preserved only in wire recordings made by folklorists, their scratchy sound a faint echo of a once resounding chorus. By the mid-20th century, the genetic isolation had largely dissolved. Descendants of the early Palatine families migrated to cities like Reading and Philadelphia, marrying into English and Scots-Irish lines. Genome-wide studies of self-identified Pennsylvania Dutch outside the Plain sects now find a patchwork of German, Swiss, and British ancestry. The old Rhineland signal faded, but still detectable in a meaningful share of participants. Yet a cultural genome survives. The Plain sects, Amish and Old Order Mennonites, retreated further into separation. Their numbers grew from a few thousand in 1900 to over 380,000 today. Inside their communities, the Deutsch language remains the mother tongue, a direct descendant of the dialects spoken in the Kraichgau and Hunsrück regions of Germany. The agricultural footprint endures too. The enormous four-bay barns, the contour plowing on Lancaster County's rolling hills, the fracture-inspired hex signs on banked barns, each a physical echo of the German village patterns brought across the Atlantic. The name is immovable. Dutch was a corruption of Deutsch, so deeply embedded that even genetic proof cannot dislodge it. We know now, from shipping manifests and church registers, that the journey began in villages like Obersilzen and Gölheim, not in the Netherlands. Yet the label remains a linguistic fossil. What survives is not the error, but the enduring cultural DNA, a plain living archipelago across the American landscape where the old tongue still hums, and the fields are tilled as they were when the first Deutsch settlers looked upon the land and called it home.